On a silent winter night when the snow fell heavier than the town could remember, a single cardboard box was left behind a church, as if someone hoped the cold would erase what they abandoned. Inside were two tiny lives barely breathing, waiting for either death or a miracle. What no one knew was that this forgotten moment would soon pull a broken police officer back from the edge of death, rescue a blind young teacher from the flames, and change an entire town forever. Before this story begins, tell me where you are watching from and leave your location in the comments. And if stories of hope and second chances touch your heart, please press subscribe to support this channel and help us share more winter miracles with the world. Snow had been falling over Pine Hollow since late afternoon, not in wild sheets but in steady, patient veils, as if the sky were laying down one quiet memory at a time. By the time night pressed its cold hand against the windows, the town was wrapped in a soft white hush. Street lamps glowed like halos, their light caught in the drifting flakes, and the church bells on the hill sent out slow, rounded notes that seemed to float between the chimneys. In the center of town, the Christmas tree rose higher than any rooftop, its branches dressed in golden lights and old ornaments that had seen more winters than most of the children laughing beneath them. Pine Hollow was not a big city, just a mountain town tucked into the folds of dark fir forests. But on the night before Christmas, it liked to pretend it was the warm center of the world. Families moved through the square in bundled layers of wool and down, stamping snow from their boots, their breath fogging the air as they carried bags and boxes toward the donation tables. There were coats softened by years of use, toys with a little paint rubbed off the corners, thick quilts that still smelled faintly of cedar. A banner above the tables read, "Christmas for Every Creature," and beside the sign, a volunteer from the local animal rescue stood collecting donations. An older woman with a knit hat pulled down over gray hair and cheeks reddened by the cold, her eyes kind but tired from long hours. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, pointing to the pictures of rescued dogs and cats taped to the tables, promising, as children always did, that they would help for real when they grew up. Officer Caleb Reed watched it all from the driver's seat of his patrol SUV, engine humming steadily, heater blowing a low tide of warm air against the windshield. He was 37, broad-shouldered in his dark winter uniform and heavy-duty parka, the kind of man whose posture seemed permanently shaped by responsibility. His hair, once a deep brown, now held a subtle frost of early gray at the temples, the result of too many long nights, too many rescue calls and storms like this. His face was lean and angular, with a straight nose and a jaw that looked like it would rather clench than tremble. There was something in his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, that spoke of far-off places and buried weight. Caleb had been a rescue officer in the mountains before he became a small-town cop. Snow and broken roads and emergencies were not strangers to him. Neither was loss. On quiet nights when the radios were still and the town slept, he could still feel the moment the avalanche came, the roar that was more vibration than sound, the spray of snow that felt like a wall, the last glimpse of his wife's red scarf before the mountains swallowed her. That memory had carved out a room inside him where the cold never melted. Even now, wrapped in layers and sitting in a warm truck, he carried that winter with him. He watched as the volunteer began folding up the donation tables, her gloved hands stiff from the cold. The crowd had thinned. Parents hurried their children home as the falling snow thickened and the wind picked up a sharp, whistling edge. Caleb checked the clock on the dashboard. The official town festival was done, but his night was just beginning. Pine Hollow might have been painted in twinkle lights and nativity scenes, but storms didn't care about Christmas. He lifted the radio, checked in with dispatch, a single woman's voice tonight, young and efficient, somewhere back in the station with a coffee cooling at her elbow, and promised to do one last, slow loop before the worst of the storm rolled in. The SUV rolled away from the square, tires crunching over packed snow. Caleb drove past small houses with warm yellow windows, past the diner with its neon sign flickering open in defiant red, past the little grocery store where a faded Santa cardboard cutout smiled from behind glass. Wreaths hung from every door, icicle lights draped from gutters. Someone had gone overboard and turned their yard into a glowing army of reindeer. The town looked like a snow globe someone had shaken just hard enough to make everything sparkle. But under the lights, Caleb's mind drifted. He had known this night could have passed like so many others, Him alone in the cabin behind the station, reheating soup out of a can, listening to the wind and the church bells and the distant laughter of families with fullness he could no longer touch. It was not resentment he felt toward them. It was a quiet, aching distance, as if he were watching life through a window he could not open. He turned down the narrow lane behind the church, where the glow of the main square blurred into softer shadows. The church itself stood with its simple steeple spearing into the snowy dark, a cross outlined in white lights. Behind it, the service road dipped slightly, leading toward the back entrance, the storage sheds, and a row of trash bins pressed up against the brick wall. This was the kind of corner Storms loved, half forgotten, where snow drifted deep. The wind funneled there, sharper, and Caleb instinctively slowed down, scanning the area with the same careful eye he used on every patrol. That was when he saw it. At first, it was just a shape near the bins, sagging into the snowbank. A cardboard box, its sides darkened and saggy from wet. Most boxes out here were empty donation remnants, waiting to be broken down and recycled. But something about this one made him frown. Someone, in quick, crooked marker, had scrawled "donation" across the top. The lid was pulled half back, as if the wind had pried at it. Snowflakes gathered on the edges, turning paper into mush. The box shivered. No, that wasn't quite right. The cardboard didn't move. Something inside it did. Caleb braked, the SUV's headlights washing the scene in pale gold. He stepped out into the cold, the air like a slap on his cheeks, his breath instantly visible. Snow creaked under his boots as he approached the box, one hand brushing his flashlight though he barely needed it. Up close, he could see the small dents in the cardboard, as if someone had gripped it too hard. The bottom was darker, soaked. The word donation stared up at him like a cruel joke. He knelt on one knee, his uniform pants pressing into the snow. The lid of the box was lighter than he expected, the cardboard already starting to soften. As he lifted it, a wave of cold, damp air rolled out, heavy with the smell of wet fur and fear. Two pairs of eyes stared back at him from the dim hollow of the box. The first puppy was larger by just a bit, its coat a classic German shepherd mix of deep sable and black, though now clumped and darkened by moisture. Its ears were still floppy with youth, one folded in on itself. Along the top of its muzzle, from just above the nose bridge back toward the forehead, ran a thin, pale scratch, barely more than a line along the fur, but sharp against the darker coat. Its eyes were a rich, dark amber, filled not with the wild brightness of a healthy pup, but with a dull, exhausted wariness. It trembled, ribs fluttering under thin fur, breath shallow and quick. This one looked like it had already decided it would fight as long as it had anything left to give. The second puppy was slightly smaller, with a lighter coat, more cream along the chest and paws, the black saddle pattern softer, like smoke drifted over snow. Its fur clung to its body in damp tufts. Its eyes, a deep brown with a soft hint of honey at the edges, held a more fragile uncertainty. The little body shivered, not just from cold, but from the shock of being somewhere that smelled of trash and metal and fear instead of warmth and voices. Its front paws were tucked under its chest, as if it were trying to turn itself into something smaller, less noticeable, as if shrinking might make the world hurt less. They couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 weeks old, barely out of the stage where they tumbled over their own paws. Yet, here they were, left behind a church in a storm, wrapped in the thin notion that donation was enough to absolve whoever had walked away. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, a familiar mix of anger and grief. He had seen neglect before, but it always hit like a fresh blow when it came wrapped in cardboard and snow. "Hey there," he murmured, his voice dropping into the low, steady tone he used for frightened kids and injured hikers. "Easy, I've got you." The larger pup, the one with the scratch, lifted its head a fraction, eyes fixed on him with an intensity that seemed too focused for something so small. The smaller one shifted, nose twitching as it drew in his scent, as if somewhere beneath the smell of wet fabric and leather holster and pine needle shampoo, it recognized something that was not threat. Caleb slipped his hands beneath them, feeling the sharpness of their bones, the chill soaked into their fur. They were light, too light. He drew them against his chest, tucking them under his coat, trapping their thin bodies between his body heat and the padded fabric. He could feel the faint thud of their hearts, rabbit fast. Snow fell on his shoulders and the brim of his hat, turning his dark uniform pale. Back in the SUV, the heater roared when he turned it up, warm air rushing out with a breathy whoosh. The puppies huddled on the passenger seat beneath his spare blanket. For a moment, as he watched them, Caleb's mind flickered to procedure, animal control, county shelter, vet. Pine Hollow had rules, and rules were there for a reason. He pulled out his phone, gloved fingers moving with practiced familiarity, as he dialed the emergency number for the local animal control center, and then the small-town vet clinic they contracted with. Both lines went to recorded messages. A calm voice explained closures due to the storm, emergencies to be handled in the morning, messages to be left after the tone. When he finally received a text back from one vet nurse, a woman named Megan he'd seen around the clinic, late 20s, hair always pinned back in a messy bun, kind eyes above a perpetually smudged mask. It was simple and apologetic. Storm lockdown. I can't get out. If you can keep them somewhere warm tonight, I'll come first thing in the morning. They just need to survive this one. Caleb stared at the words. He looked at the puppies, at the way the larger one put itself slightly in front of the smaller without even seeming to think about it, as if this had already been its role for some time. If he squinted, he could almost see another winter night, another emergency, another life he had tried to pull from the cold and lost. The memory threatened to rise like a wave, but he shoved it back down. These two were still here. He could feel their warmth now, faint but present, radiating through the blanket. The station was too small, the cells too cold and sterile. There was nowhere there meant for something that needed soft things. Caleb could imagine the look on the chief's face if he showed up with two half-frozen puppies and asked to tuck them into an evidence locker. He exhaled slowly, the sound somewhere between a sigh and a decision. "All right," he said aloud, mostly to himself. "You're coming home with me." His home was a small wooden cabin nestled just behind the station, half lost among scrub pines and snowdrifts. The town had built it decades ago as a temporary residence for whoever served as Pine Hollow's night duty officer, a place where they could crash between emergencies. For Caleb, it had become a halfway house between a past that no longer existed and a future he did not quite know how to enter. The cabin had one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a brick fireplace that smoked a little when the wind blew wrong, and shelves that still held his wife's favorite battered paperbacks. Most nights, it felt less like a home and more like a storage space for memories that didn't know where else to go. He carried the puppies inside, cradled against his chest. The cabin's interior was chilly when he opened the door. He had left the thermostat low to save energy when he was on patrol. With one hand, he flipped the switch to the electric baseboard heaters and then knelt by the fireplace, stacking kindling and logs with the smooth, economical motions of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Soon the first flames took, spitting a few sparks before settling into a steady burn. The light rolled over the room, turning wood paneling into a warm amber and throwing shadows that danced along the walls. He set the puppies on an old folded quilt near the hearth, a quilt his wife had insisted they keep, even when the edges had begun to fray, because everything soft deserves a second life. The irony of that was not lost on him now. He pulled off his gloves and gently rubbed their damp fur with a worn towel, working the water out in small circles. The larger pup tolerated it with a stoic endurance, eyes half-lidded, occasionally pressing its nose into his wrist, as if testing whether this warmth was real. The smaller one shivered and then leaned full weight against his hand whenever he paused, pressing closer as though it had decided he might just be the safest thing in the room. After a few minutes, he filled a shallow bowl with warm water and powdered puppy milk substitute he kept in a cupboard for emergency rescues. It was technically past its best-by date, but still safe, and he stirred it until the liquid was smooth and pale. The smell rose up, sweet, faintly creamy, and something in the puppies woke like a spark catching dry tinder. The larger pup nosed the bowl first, tongue flicking cautiously, then more eagerly. The smaller one followed, its tiny pink tongue lapping clumsily, splashing a bit on its nose. Caleb steadied the bowl with one hand, watching them drink as if the simple act were a miracle. In a way, it was. Every swallow was a decision to keep going. When their bellies were round with warmth, He pulled another blanket from a chest at the foot of the couch. It was wool, slightly scratchy, smelling faintly of lavender detergent, and, if he let himself believe it, a whisper of his wife's perfume. He hesitated, fingers tracing the worn edge, then spread it over the puppies. They burrowed into it instinctively, small shapes sinking into soft folds. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, the wind picked up, rattling a few stubborn icicles against the eaves. Caleb sat back on his heels, studying them. The larger pup had already shifted so that its body formed a half-curved shield around the smaller one. Even asleep, it looked like it was on duty, its breathing a little rough but determined. "You," he murmured, a corner of his mouth tugging upward for the first time that night. "You're trouble, I can tell. The kind that runs into storms instead of away from them." He paused, thinking of flickers of heat, of the way this one had pushed itself forward even when barely conscious. "You're Blaze." His gaze moved to the smaller pup, curled into the curve of the blanket, a pale paw draped over its own nose, as if trying to block out the world and rest. It had survived a cardboard box in a storm behind a church, without even understanding what abandoned meant. Its fur, light where the others was dark, caught the firelight and turned to a soft, glowing cream. "And you," he said softly, "you're Snow. You don't look like it, but you're tougher than you know. Not many make it through a night like this." He leaned back against the couch, the heat from the fire loosening the stiffness in his shoulders. He should have been thinking about paperwork, about calls to the county in the morning, about vaccinations and foster lists. Instead, he found himself simply listening to the soft tick of the cooling heater vents, the occasional snap from the fireplace, the slow, evening out breaths of two small lives that had almost been lost under a word scrawled in marker. "If you've made it this far," he murmured, eyes half closed, "I guess God's not done with you yet." He didn't know if he believed the words, not the way the preacher in the church did, but tonight they felt less like a recital and more like a fragile hope. Outside, the storm gathered itself, wind curling around the cabin like a living thing. Snow climbed the porch steps, softened the outline of the patrol SUV, blurred the world beyond the frosted windows. In other years, at this hour, the cabin had felt like a hollow shell with a single heart beating inside it, too loud against all that silence. Tonight, with the fire breathing warmth into the room and two sleeping puppies tucked into his wife's old blanket, the silence changed. It did not recede. It shifted. It became less of an emptiness and more of a space where something new could grow. Caleb watched Blaze's chest rise and fall, heard Snow sigh in its sleep, a tiny, contented sound like a question finally answered. Somewhere deep inside him, in the room the avalanche had carved out and left frozen, a small corner began to thaw. For the first time in many winters, as the night before Christmas wrapped itself around Pine Hollow, Officer Caleb Reed sat in his little cabin and realized that when he looked around, the place no longer felt entirely, hopelessly alone. Morning arrived in Pine Hollow the way it always did after a heavy snow, quietly and without apology. The storm had loosened its grip, but not released it entirely. The world outside Officer Caleb Reed's cabin lay buried beneath thick, undisturbed drifts that softened rooftops, mailboxes, fence lines, and even the narrow streets into gentle curves of white. The sky hovered low and pale, heavy with leftover cloud, as if the night had simply turned down its darkness but left the cold behind. Smoke drifted steadily from chimneys across town, thin gray lines rising into the frost-bitten air, a sign that, despite everything, people were awake and surviving another winter morning. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned itself low. The red coals still glowed faintly beneath a layer of ash, radiating just enough warmth to keep the small room from freezing. Caleb stirred awake on the couch where he had slept in his uniform, boots discarded by the door, jacket draped over the armrest. For a moment, disorientation flickered through him, the familiar ache in his chest reaching for the empty side of the room where his wife used to be. Then he heard it, the soft, uneven breathing of two small creatures curled together near the hearth. Blaze lay stretched protectively along one side of the quilt, his larger body forming a barrier between the fire and the smaller form tucked close to his chest. Even asleep, the pup seemed alert, his ears twitching faintly at every crack of the cooling wood. Snow lay half beneath his chin, her pale paws folded against her chest, her breath tiny puffs of warmth that barely stirred the air. The light from the frosted window washed over their fur, turning dark to silver and pale to pearl. For several quiet seconds, Caleb simply watched them, a strange stillness settling over him. He had rescued people from crevices, pulled bodies from snowbanks, dragged strangers out of river currents thick with ice. Yet the sight of two small puppies sleeping safely in his cabin stirred him in a way none of that ever had. He rose quietly, stoked the fire with a new log, then moved to the kitchenette to warm more milk. When the faint scent of warmth reached Blaze, the pup's eyes cracked open, amber glinting in the firelight. Snow stirred a heartbeat later, lifting her head with a weak but hopeful wobble. Caleb knelt beside them, steadying the shallow bowl as they drank. Blaze pushed forward with restrained hunger, careful but determined, while Snow lapped more slowly, pausing often as if still unsure the warmth would remain. By the time the sun fought its way through the clouds in a weak, watery glow, Caleb was already dressed for duty. Dispatch crackled through the radio, with word of road inspections and wellness checks near the forest edge. Several elderly residents lived out that way, along with one woman who had become a quiet subject of town concern during storms. Her name was Emily Carter. Emily Carter was 28 years old, blind, since the age of 12 after a viral infection had stolen her sight in less than 6 months. She lived alone in a small wood-sided cabin nearly 3 miles from the church, at the far end of a narrow road that wound like a frozen ribbon between pine trees and rocky embankments. She had refused to leave Pine Hollow after losing her vision, refusing the well-meaning suggestions that she relocate closer to town or move in with family elsewhere. Emily was slender and of average height. With soft brown hair she wore tied low at the nape of her neck, the loose strands always escaping to frame a face that held both gentleness and quiet defiance. Her eyes, though clouded and unfocused, still carried expression in the set of her brows, in the lift of her cheekbones when she smiled. She taught kindergarten at the local school, navigating her classroom with practiced precision, guided by voices, textures, and memory rather than sight. The accident that had taken her vision had not hardened her, but it had sharpened her. She listened more carefully than most people spoke. She trusted slowly but deeply. And in storms like this one, when roads disappeared beneath snow and silence grew heavy, she became one of Caleb's quiet worries. He hesitated only a moment before lifting the quilt with the 2 puppies wrapped inside. "You're coming with me?" he murmured. "The vet said closer to people is better, and we're headed somewhere warm." Blaze accepted the movement without protest. Snow pressed closer, and soon both were bundled securely against Caleb's chest as he stepped back out into the whitened world. The drive toward Emily's cabin was slow and deliberate. Snowbanks edged the road like rising walls, and tree branches sagged beneath the weight of frozen powder. The forest stood in hushed rows, every needle frosted, every trunk dark with cold. The only sound was the steady crunch of tires and the faint rhythmic whisper of the engine. Occasionally, Blaze lifted his head as if tracking something unseen beyond the windshield. Snow slept, her body swaying gently with the motion of the truck. Emily's cabin emerged gradually from the curtain of white, its roof thick with snow, a thin ribbon of gray smoke drifting from the metal chimney. The path to her front door was half buried, softened into a slope of untouched snow. Caleb parked as close as he could manage and stepped out, the cold biting instantly through his gloves. He knocked firmly, then again, stamping his feet against the frost. The door opened with a careful, measured movement. Emily stood in the doorway wrapped in a thick sweater and wool shawl, her hair still loosely tied, her face pale from the morning cold. Her eyes did not focus on him, but her smile came immediately, guided by sound. "Officer Reed," she said gently. "I wondered if someone would make it out this far today." Caleb nodded, though she could not see it. "Road's rough, but passable for now. I just wanted to check your heat and make sure you're all right." He shifted the bundle in his arms. At the sound of her voice, Snow stirred, releasing a soft, questioning whimper. Emily's brow lifted. "That doesn't sound like rescue equipment." Caleb allowed himself a quiet huff of amusement. "You could say they're temporary partners." He lowered the quilt carefully so she could reach them. Her fingers moved cautiously at first, mapping the unfamiliar shape, then freezing in gentle surprise as warm fur met her palms. Blaze sniffed her hand, then nudged it with his nose. Snow pressed her forehead into Emily's fingers and sighed. "Oh," Emily whispered, her entire posture softening. "You're freezing little souls, aren't you?" "They were left behind the church last night," Caleb said. "Barely made it through the storm. Vets closed until morning." Her mouth tightened briefly in quiet anger, then eased again as she stroked Snow's small head. "Then, they're exactly where they should be, right now." Inside, her cabin was warm but fragile in its safety. Handrails lined the walls from doorway to kitchen to bedroom, carefully placed and worn smooth by years of use. The furniture was modest, arranged with precise intent. On one wall hung dozens of paper stars and drawings in bright crayon colors, gifts from her students. Caleb moved through the space silently, checking the thermostat, the pilot light, the gas lines with a practiced eye. The pipes near the wall bore faint rust stains, and when he knelt closer, he caught the faintest metallic odor beneath the usual scent of wood smoke. "These lines are old," he said quietly. "They're holding for now, but once the storm clears, I'm calling someone in to replace them." Emily nodded. "I've smelled that before sometimes. I thought it was just the heater aging." "It is," he replied. "And aging things tend to surprise you at the worst times. If you smell anything strong before I come back, you call the station immediately." Her hand rested lightly on Snow's head, fingers still moving. "If anything smells wrong," she said softly, "I suspect these two will know before either of us." Caleb stayed longer than protocol required, shoveling a narrow path across her porch, checking the back door, restacking firewood closer to the wall so she could reach it without stepping far into the snow. Blaze followed every movement, curious but cautious, while Snow remained close to Emily's feet, tail giving slow, uneven thumps against the floor. By late afternoon, the sky darkened again. Snow began to fall in heavier sheets, the kind that blurred distance into nothing and swallowed sound. Caleb stood by the door, conflicted. "The storm's coming back harder tonight," he said. "If you're comfortable with it, I'd like to leave the puppies here with you. I'll be on active duty, might not get back until late. They'll keep each other warm, and you won't be alone." Emily did not hesitate. She smiled toward where he stood, though she could not see him. "I think we could all use the company." He knelt, adjusting the quilt one last time. Blaze met his gaze, steady and unblinking. Snow whimpered softly as if sensing change. "I'll be back in the morning," Caleb said. "No matter what." He left as the snow thickened, headlights carving narrow tunnels through the white. Inside the cabin, Emily moved carefully, guided by memory and gentle paw steps. She placed water near the hearth, spread extra blankets, then settled into the armchair with Snow curled close to her knees, and Blaze stretched at her side. The radio murmured softly in the background, old Christmas hymns drifting through the room like echoes from another time. Outside, the storm built its voice again, but inside the cabin, warmth gathered in quiet circles, human breath and animal heat folding together as the night closed in. Christmas Day arrived without celebration for the outer edges of Pine Hollow. The main street had been cleared just enough for churchgoers and last-minute shoppers to move again, but the narrow roads near the forest still lay half-swallowed by drifts and shadow. Snow continued to fall in thick, stubborn sheets, the kind that did not dance but pressed downward with quiet insistence, as though the sky itself were heavy with unfinished grief. Church bells rang through the cold noon air, distant and muffled, their sound fading long before it reached the cabins scattered along the tree line. At Emily Carter's home, the radio played softly in the background, cycling through old Christmas hymns recorded decades earlier, the voices faint and wavering as though carried through layers of time. Emily sat in her armchair beside the stove, wrapped in a knitted shawl, her fingers resting on the warm iron frame. Snow lay curled at her feet, her small body tucked tightly against Emily's ankles, absorbing every ounce of available heat. Blaze paced slowly between the hearth and the door, his movement restless but not frantic, the way a watchful creature circles when it senses the world shifting but cannot yet name the threat. The cabin itself was quiet, but not peacefully so. Beneath the soft music and the gentle crack of burning wood, there was another presence, subtle and nearly imperceptible at first. the faint, metallic thread of gas seeping invisibly into the air. It mixed with the scent of pine smoke and old timber, thin enough to be dismissed as imagination, strong enough to awaken something primitive deep within the puppies. Blaze stopped pacing. His ears lifted fully, rigid now. The fine hairs along his back rose in an instinctive bristle. He lowered his head and sniffed the air again, more sharply this time. Snow stirred, lifting her nose from Emily's ankle, nostrils fluttering. A soft, uncertain whine escaped her throat. Emily did not notice the change at first. Her attention remained on the radio, on the remembered cadence of voices singing about distant mangers and gentle stars. It was Snow who nudged her first, pressing insistently at her shin, her small body trembling with unease. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emily murmured, bending slightly forward. Blaze moved closer now, his soft growl vibrating low in his chest, a warning not yet directed, but impossible to ignore. Emily's brow creased faintly. She inhaled slowly, deliberately, the way she had learned to do when something felt wrong but not yet dangerous. The smell reached her then, faint but undeniable beneath the smoke of burning wood. Her heartbeat stuttered. "Gas," she whispered. The word left her mouth not as panic, but as recognition. Years of living alone had taught her to listen when unease spoke quietly. She reached for the phone on the small table beside her chair, her fingers trembling as they located the familiar grooves of the keypad. At that exact moment, the hiss beneath the stove sharpened abruptly, as if the hidden leak had found sudden permission to speak. Blaze's growl burst into sharp, frantic barking. Snow yelped once, high and scared. The explosion was not thunderous. It was not the dramatic roar of cinema. It was a blunt, vicious concussion, gas igniting in a confined space with violent certainty. The stove flared outward in a sudden white-orange flash. The curtains nearest the wall erupted instantly. The air compressed, then expanded, hurling heat and smoke across the room. Emily cried out and recoiled, the chair tipping backward under her sudden movement. Smoke surged toward the ceiling in thick, choking waves. The radio fell silent beneath the crash of shattering glass. Blaze lunged through the smoke toward the door, barking in wild, panicked bursts. Snow followed blindly, slipping on the wooden floor, her small claws scrabbling in terror. Outside, the storm howled as if answering the fire's sudden voice. Smoke forced itself through every crack in the cabin's skin, staining the white snow beyond the porch a dirty gray. The front door burst open as Blaze hurled his small body against it. Snow tumbled after him into the freezing air. For one brief, terrible second, both puppies stood in the swirling snow, their fur instantly dusted white, the heat of the burning cabin roaring behind them. Then Blaze turned back. He ran to the door again and again, barking with frantic insistence, his body trembling with confused urgency. Snow darted in close, then recoiled, coughing faintly as smoke spilled outward. The cold air bit at their lungs. The fire cracked and snapped behind them, ravenous now. 3 houses down, a neighbor named Harold Benton, a retired mechanic in his late 60s, broad-backed and slow-moving, but still stubbornly active, opened his door to check the rising smoke he had noticed through his kitchen window. His gray beard was half frozen with condensation from his own breath as he stepped onto the porch. It was then he saw them, 2 small shapes darting through the storm, silhouettes against the burning glow. "What in God's name?" he murmured, squinting into the snow. Blaze ran straight for him, not in fear, but in pleading. The puppy skidded to a stop against Harold's boots and barked, again and again, sharp and piercing. Snow followed close, whining, circling Harold's legs with desperate urgency. The old man's heart kicked hard in his chest. He followed their gaze back to the cabin, now bleeding smoke from its windows. "Fire," he breathed. He turned and ran inside, hands shaking as he reached for the phone. The line rang only once before the emergency dispatcher answered. "Emily Carter's place is burning," Harold said, his voice hoarse. "She's blind. She can't—" He did not finish the sentence. Across town, Officer Caleb Reed had just cleared a traffic check near the church when the call came over the radio. The dispatcher's voice tightened. "Structure fire near the forest edge. Possible trapped occupant. It's Emily Carter." Caleb's world narrowed to a single point. He slammed the patrol vehicle into motion, tires screaming against ice as he swung onto the unplowed road. Snow lashed against the windshield in blinding waves. The heater roared uselessly against the sudden chill that flooded his chest. He reached the outer road in under 7 minutes. Smoke was visible long before the cabin came into view, a dark column twisting violently into the storm. Harold stood in the snow waving his arms, the puppies bounding frantically around his legs. Caleb braked hard and leapt from the SUV. "She's still inside," Harold shouted over the wind. Caleb did not hesitate. He pulled on the basic respirator mask from his emergency kit, knowing full well it was never meant for a structure fire this intense. He lowered his head and ran straight into the smoke. Inside the cabin, the world was chaos. Heat crushed in from every direction. Flames climbed the walls in fast, devouring tongues. The floor burned beneath his boots. The air was so thick with smoke that vision shrank to less than an arm's reach. Caleb moved low, one gloved hand dragging along the wall, his lungs already protesting as the mask struggled to keep pace. "Emily!" he shouted. The sound was swallowed almost immediately. From deeper inside, he heard coughing, ragged, desperate, disoriented. He followed it, heart pounding violently against his ribs. He found her collapsed beside the overturned chair, one arm raised weakly as she tried to crawl without knowing which direction meant escape. Her shawl smoldered at the edge. Her hair had begun to singe. Caleb dropped to his knees beside her, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders and beating down the small flames along her sleeve with his gloved hands. "I've got you!" he shouted into her ear. "You're not alone. You're not alone." He lifted her with effort, the heat sapping strength with every second. Smoke clawed at his throat and lungs. His vision swam. He staggered forward through the burning haze, following memory more than sight now, counting steps, turning where the doorway should be. The back door loomed through the smoke at last, warped but still intact. He kicked it open with the last reserve of strength in his legs. Cold air rushed in like mercy. Blaze and Snow were waiting. They barked wildly as Caleb emerged carrying Emily. Snow darted close, brushing against Emily's boots, whining frantically. Blaze ran tight circles around them, as if afraid the human might vanish again if he stopped watching her. Caleb pushed forward through the snow, each step a battle as dizziness washed over him in heavy waves. Behind them, the cabin's roof gave way with a deep, thunderous crack. Flames burst upward in a savage pillar of light as the structure began to collapse into itself. Sirens pierced the storm moments later. The volunteer, fire engine from Pine Hollow arrived with chains rattling and tires sliding. Firefighters moved with urgent precision, unspooling hoses, shouting commands swallowed by wind and steam. Emily was transferred into the arms of paramedics. Her skin was pale beneath the soot, her breathing labored but intact. She reached blindly into the air until Snow pressed against her leg, and she clutched at the warm fur with trembling relief. Caleb took one staggering step backward, his task completed, the adrenaline bleeding out of his veins like warmth from an open wound. The edges of his vision darkened. He dropped to one knee, then another. Someone shouted his name. He did not hear it. Smoke-filled lungs finally rebelled. Caleb Reed collapsed into the snow beside the ambulance, his body shuddering once before going still. Red emergency lights washed over his face, bathing it in a pale, unreal glow. The storm continued to fall around him, soft and relentless, burying everything beneath the same quiet cover. This time, Winter did not take his wife. This time, Winter reached for him. The hospital of Pine Hollow was not built for drama. It was small, square, practical, its bricks dark with age and winter moisture, its windows glowing softly beneath layers of frost. On most nights, it received little more than broken bones from icy steps, chest infections from stubborn elders who refused to rest, and the occasional emergency from the highway that cut through the mountain pass. But on this Christmas night, the hospital carried a different weight in its halls, the kind that presses against the heart even before anyone speaks. Officer Caleb Reed lay in room 203 of the intensive care unit, his body stilled beneath layers of warming blankets, his breath drawn not by will, but by the steady rhythm of machines. A clear tube curved from his mouth toward the ventilator beside the bed, Thin wires trailed from his chest to the monitor above him, where pale green lines crawled and dipped with fragile persistence. His face, usually carved by cold wind and resolve, now rested slack and colorless, faint smudges of soot still shadowing the edges of his jaw and hairline. The lungs that had once pulled air through blizzards and fire now struggled beneath the burden of smoke. The doctor who admitted him was Dr. Harold Wexler, a man in his early 50s with silver at his temples and a quiet steadiness in his hands. He had known Caleb not as a patient, but as a presence in the town, at car accidents, at winter rescues, at the hospital doors when victims arrived shaking and half frozen. As he reviewed the scans and blood oxygen levels, his mouth tightened slightly. "Severe smoke inhalation," he told the nurse beside him. "We've stabilized him for now, but the next 24 hours will tell us everything." Outside the ICU doors, Emily Carter sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her forearms were wrapped in fresh bandages from minor burns, the skin beneath tender but healing. Smoke had left its mark in her lungs as well, though she had been spared the deeper damage. She sat perfectly still on the narrow plastic chair, her back straight, head tilted just enough to listen to the sounds that moved through the corridor, the squeak of distant wheels, the soft murmur of nurses, the echo of footsteps that approached and passed without stopping. To anyone watching, she appeared calm. Only the faint tremor in her fingers betrayed the storm inside her. Beside her sat Margaret Hayes. Margaret was 71, broad-shouldered, with a posture that had never quite learned how to shrink. Her white hair was pulled into a thick bun at the back of her head, secured with a faded scrunchie she had owned for years. Deep lines framed her mouth and eyes, carved by laughter as much as worry, and her gaze was sharp behind rectangular glasses. She had served as the hospital's head nurse for almost 3 decades before retiring 5 years earlier. In Pine Hollow, people still spoke her name with automatic respect. To Caleb, she had been something between mentor and mother. Since the first winter, he arrived half frozen from a rescue with frostbitten fingers and a broken partner. Margaret held Emily's hand firmly, her grip steady and grounding. "That boy always did run straight into the worst of things," she muttered, more affection than scold in her voice. Like the cold didn't apply to him. Emily swallowed. "He saved me," she said quietly. "If he hadn't come back for me, I wouldn't be here." Margaret squeezed her hand a little tighter. "And because of that, he will not be alone now. Not on my watch." Inside the ICU, Nurse Linda Chavez moved with gentle efficiency. She was in her early 40s, slender, with dark hair kept short for practicality rather than style. Years of night shifts had painted faint shadows beneath her eyes, but they had not dulled the warmth in them. Linda had been on duty the night Caleb was brought in, had watched as the smoke-blackened officer was transferred onto the bed, had monitored the steady struggle of his lungs for each breath. She had seen many patients hover between worlds. Few had carried the quiet gravity that surrounded this one. At the edge of the hospital grounds, in a heated enclosure attached to the emergency wing, Blaze and Snow lay curled inside a temporary kennel provided by the small animal rescue that partnered with the clinic. The space was clean, padded, and warm, but it was not home. The puppies had been bathed, their fur cleared of soot and snow, their small bodies checked for burns and inhalation damage. Physically, they were safe. Emotionally, they were restless. Blaze paced along the length of the enclosure with a tireless loop, nose brushing the gate every few steps, ears constantly rotating toward the distant sounds of hospital life. Snow remained closer to the center, but her eyes followed Blaze's every movement. At night, when the building quieted, both lifted their heads toward the same direction, the ICU wing, and whimpered softly, as if calling across some invisible distance. Emily asked every evening for news of Caleb's condition. The doctors were careful with their words. "Stable," they told her. "No worse. Not awake yet." She listened without interruption, nodding, absorbing each syllable as though sound could replace sight. Still, as the night stretched on, a new fear took root in her chest, that he might remain suspended forever between breath and waking. On the 4th night, as snow fell once more against the hospital windows and the corridor grew quiet beneath the hush of late hours, Emily spoke the thought she had held inside since the fire. "I need to see him," she said to Margaret. "Not just be near him. I need to be with him." Margaret exhaled slowly. ICU has rules for a reason, child. Emily lifted her face toward the sound of her voice. So did the fire, and he crossed those. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she shifted her grip on Emily's hand, thoughtful. Let me speak to Linda. Linda listened without interruption when Margaret approached her at the nurse's station, Emily seated quietly beside them. The request was simple, but heavy with consequence. Not only to allow Emily into the ICU beyond visiting hours, but to bring the puppies with her. Linda's jaw tightened with the familiar battle between protocol and conscience. Officially, I can't, she said. If anyone sees, they won't, Margaret replied, because I'll be right here with you, and if someone does, they can argue with me tomorrow. Emily did not beg. She did not raise her voice. She simply said, They saved me too. Linda closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, her decision was already made. 5 minutes, she said. No more. The route they took was not the main ICU entrance. Linda guided them through a narrower service corridor near the emergency wing, the floor echoing softly beneath careful steps. She carried Snow inside her jacket to shield her from the chill, while Blaze walked close at her side on a thin leash borrowed from the rescue. Emily followed with one hand resting against the wall, the other lightly holding Margaret's sleeve. Room 203 was dim, lit only by the soft glow of monitors and the faint reflection of hall lights off the window. The rhythmic sound of the ventilator filled the space, mechanical and steady. Caleb lay unmoving, his chest rising and falling with assisted breath. Linda checked the lines and monitors quickly before allowing the others inside. Don't touch the tubes, she whispered, and keep your voices low. Blaze entered first. He froze at the threshold, confusion rippling through his body at the unfamiliar smells and sounds. Then he lifted his head, scent catching on something deeper than sterile air and medication. With a soft, uncertain sound in his throat, he pulled gently forward. Linda loosened the leash. Blaze climbed onto the chair beside the bed, then carefully placed his front paws on the mattress. He leaned his chin against Caleb's hand, resting there, as though this were the only place he had ever meant to be. Snow squirmed inside Linda's jacket until she was lowered gently onto the bed near Caleb's side. She turned in a tight circle once, then settled against his ribs, her small body radiating warmth into his still chest. Emily moved closer. Linda guided her hand to the edge of the bed. Emily's fingers brushed first against the blanket, then against the back of Blaze's neck, then finally against Caleb's wrist. His skin was warm, alive. She did not cry. Instead, she spoke quietly, her voice steady but threaded with emotion. You kept your promise, she whispered. You said you would come back. The heart monitor did not spike dramatically. It did not leap into sudden alarm, but something shifted, the thin, even line that had traced Caleb's life through. Mechanical steadiness began to change. The intervals between beats shortened, then steadied again, with new strength. The ventilator adjusted automatically, as his lungs took a slightly deeper breath on their own. Linda stared at the screen, her breath caught half in her chest. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. Blaze lifted his head and let out a soft whine. Snow stirred slightly against Caleb's side and nudged closer. The changes were subtle, so subtle that science could dismiss them as coincidence. But no one in that room believed in coincidence anymore. After only a few minutes, Linda knew they had to go. The risk was too great to linger. She helped Emily withdraw her hand slowly. Blaze resisted leaving the bed, his paws stiff with reluctance, but he allowed Linda to guide him gently back onto the floor. Snow whimpered softly as she was lifted again into the safety of Linda's jacket. As they exited the room, the heart monitor continued its steady, slightly stronger rhythm behind them. Back in the corridor, Margaret released a long, shaky breath. I've seen machines fail, I've seen bodies give up, and I've seen people come back from worse than this, she said. But I have never seen two paws do what those two just did. Emily stood quietly, her face tilted toward the direction they had just left. He knows they were there, she said. Linda hesitated, then nodded. I think he does. Behind the closed door of room 203, Officer Caleb Reed remained unconscious. The storm outside the hospital continued to fall in silent layers, but somewhere beneath the weight of smoke and winter, beneath the machines and the wire, beneath the long shadow of loss, Something inside him had begun to answer. Morning seeped into the ICU, not as sunlight, but as a thin, pale suggestion behind frosted glass. The storm had finally loosened its grip on Pine Hollow, leaving the world outside buried, quiet, and aching with after cold. Inside room 203, machines murmured with mechanical patience, their steady rhythm marking the boundary between stillness and survival. Dr. Harold Wexler stood at the foot of Caleb Reed's bed, arms folded, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the monitor. The numbers had shifted just enough overnight to draw his attention. Oxygen saturation had stabilized. Heart rate remained elevated but consistent. The fragile balance that had defined Caleb's body since the fire was tipping, not toward collapse, but toward response. "He's fighting," the doctor said quietly to Nurse Linda, who adjusted an IV line with practiced hands. "Let's see if the body wants to join the effort." The reduction of sedation began cautiously. Not a dramatic withdrawal, not a gamble, just a gentle step back from the edge. The ventilator continued to breathe for him, but the machine now allowed more room for human effort beneath its guiding rhythm. When Emily was told she could visit that afternoon, she stood very still as the nurse spoke. "He may not wake up," the nurse warned gently. "Not today, but he might feel you." Emily nodded, her face calm, her hands folded around the strap of her bag, as if it were an anchor. "That's enough," she said. Margaret accompanied her to the door, pressing a small cross into her palm before letting go. "For courage," she said gruffly, "and stubbornness, both come in handy." Inside the room, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and warmed plastic. Caleb lay much as he had the night before, but something in his posture had changed. The slackness had eased. The deep colorlessness in his skin was giving way to the muted warmth of returning circulation. Emily moved to the bedside, guided by Linda's quiet instructions. Her fingers found the edge of the mattress, then the blanket. Then, after a pause filled with breath, Caleb's hand. It was warm. She inhaled sharply, not in fear, but relief. "You're still here," she whispered. "You didn't vanish between the machines." Blaze and Snow waited just beyond the threshold, their temporary status as emotional support animals reluctantly approved for short supervised visits by a department head who had once served as a field medic and recognized the look of men who hovered between worlds. Blaze entered first, slower now than before, his posture less frantic and more cautious, as if he sensed that speed itself might be too loud here. Snow followed close behind, her steps uncertain but determined. Blaze placed his chin against Caleb's wrist again, not as urgently this time, but with a quiet, enduring confidence. Snow climbed higher onto the mattress, curling carefully near his ribs. The warmth of her small body radiated into the fragile rise and fall of his chest. Emily spoke to him then, not in pleas, not in fear, but in steady detail. She told him about the children at school, asking when she would return, about how Harold Benton kept visiting the burned cabin every morning to check on the embers, as if the building might rise again from ash, about Margaret scolding the coffee machine at the hospital for never making anything strong enough to suit her. As her voice moved through the room, something inside Caleb's body stirred. At first it was barely visible, a tightening of muscle along the forearm, a small change in the angle of his fingers. Linda noticed it immediately and stilled the others with a subtle gesture. "Caleb," Emily said softly, though she did not yet know what the nurse had seen. His fingers twitched once, then again. Blaze lifted his head sharply, ears pricking forward. Snow shifted, letting out a soft, hopeful sound that vibrated more than it echoed. It was not waking, not yet. But it was no longer absence. Over the next 2 days, the changes came in fragments, a flutter beneath the eyelids, a shallow breath taken without the machine's command, a subtle tightening of the jaw when voices filled the room. The ventilator was gradually reduced, its mechanical authority yielding space to human effort. Each small improvement was recorded, measured, tested against caution. Emily came every day. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes she simply sat with his hand in hers, the presence of her warmth and Snow's breathing forming a quiet circle around him. Blaze remained close, his posture that of a sentry who had learned patience. On the fourth morning after the sedation was reduced, the sun finally broke through the clouds in a pale winter beam that slipped through the window and rested across Caleb's face. Emily was mid-sentence, recounting how one of her students had insisted on mailing a Christmas card to the brave man in the machines, when she felt his hand tighten around her fingers. "Caleb," she whispered. His eyelids trembled. Once, twice. Then they lifted. The world that returned to him did not rush. It unfolded in layers, first light, then blur, then the faint outline of movement at the edge of his vision. The hum of machines registered as sound before it made meaning. The weight in his chest felt immense, as if winter itself had settled into his lungs. The first thing he recognized was warmth. The second was fur. Snow's ears framed his view in soft, triangular shadows. Blaze's nose hovered just above his knuckles, breath ghosting faintly across his skin. His lips parted. No sound came. Panic flickered briefly through his body until he realized the air was still moving, slow and assisted, but steady. Emily leaned closer, her face trembling into his field of awareness. Her eyes did not focus on him, but her smile did. It broke across her face like sunrise. "You came back," she said. His voice emerged as a rough whisper, thin and fractured, but unmistakably alive. "Looks like I missed Christmas dinner." The room exhaled. Linda turned away and pretended very hard that she needed to adjust equipment. Margaret wept openly in the hallway when the news reached her. Recovery did not surge forward, it inched. The ventilator was removed 2 days later. Breathing without the machine felt like scaling an invisible mountain with every inhale. Physical therapy followed soon after. Caleb's legs shook when he was helped into a sitting position. His muscles protested the return to gravity. Each step taken with the walker was a battle between memory and frailty. Blaze walked ahead of him during those early hallway sessions, moving only as fast as Caleb could follow. Snow stayed pressed to his side, her small body brushing his leg with every step, anchoring him in rhythm rather than destination. "He trusts them," one therapist remarked quietly to Emily as they watched the careful procession. "That kind of trust can pull people back from places medicine cannot reach." Weeks passed. Winter loosened its hold bit by bit. Snow on the hospital roof melted into slow, steady tears that traced the windows like softened grief. Caleb's strength returned unevenly, some days stubborn and hard-fought, others trembling with setback and exhaustion. On one such afternoon, Emily sat beside him as he rested in a chair near the window, the puppies curled at his feet. "You never told me," she said gently, "why you stayed in Pine Hollow after everything." He was quiet for a long moment. "Because running would have meant the mountain won," he finally said. "And I wasn't willing to give it that victory too." Emily smiled without pity. "Then it seems the mountain lost twice." He looked down at Blaze and Snow. "Feels more like I borrowed a win I didn't earn." By the time Caleb took his first unaided steps outside the ICU, word had already spread quietly through Pine Hollow. Not as rumor, not as spectacle, but as relief. The officer who had faced fire and snow for others was learning how to breathe again. On the morning he was wheeled out of intensive care, the hallway was lined not with crowds, but with quiet witnesses. A janitor who had seen him carry victims through the snow, a nurse from pediatrics, a volunteer fireman with burn scars on his hands. No one spoke loudly. They didn't need to. Emily walked beside the wheelchair. Blaze followed. Snow rode carefully in her lap, her small head resting beneath Emily's chin. Winter had not released him easily, but it had released him. Spring did not arrive in Pine Hollow with celebration. It came quietly, the way survival often does, one softened edge at a time. The snow along the roads receded into narrow gray rivers, trickling toward ditches and disappearing into earth that still felt half frozen. Ice loosened its grip on rooftops, falling in heavy, sudden sheets that startled birds into the air. The mountains remained white at their peaks, unmoved by seasons. But below them, the town began to breathe again. Caleb Reed returned to his cabin behind the station one morning with a walker in one hand and Snow's small, eager body tugging gently at the other. Blaze padded ahead, checking every threshold as if danger still lingered in the corners of ordinary life. Caleb was thinner now, his shoulders less broad beneath his jacket, his steps cautious but purposeful. His lungs ached when the cold air cut too sharply, and some nights the memory of fire still clawed at his breath. Yet he was alive. Every step across the porch proved it. The story did not spread through Pine Hollow as gossip. It spread as gratitude, as something people spoke of in lowered voices in the diner, in brief nods outside the post office, in folded letters that appeared in the mailbox at the station with no return address. Someone started a collection jar on the counter of the grocery store beneath a handwritten sign that read, "For the man, the girl, and the 2 small dogs." The owner of the hardware store added a locked box beside the register. The church elders mentioned it gently after Sunday service. No one called it charity. They called it paying forward a debt the town itself had survived. Emily Carter returned to teaching at the start of spring. The children rushed her the first morning, wrapping her legs in fierce little arms, clamoring at once to tell her their stories. She listened as she always had, head tilted, fingers resting lightly against their shoulders as if mapping the sound of their joy. Snow waited at the classroom door that day, a small white and black sentinel beneath the coat rack, while Blaze lay beneath Emily's desk, alert but calm. The school board had debated for precisely 5 minutes before agreeing the dogs could stay. Some rules, even in quiet mountain towns, bent easily for the right kind of miracle. Caleb came by some afternoons, moving slowly along the hallway with a slight hitch still left in his step. The children stared at first, wide-eyed at the scars on his hands and the oxygen cannula he sometimes still needed after exertion. Then one brave child reached out and asked if Blaze was a real police dog. Caleb laughed, a rough, rusted sound that surprised even him, and said, "Not yet, but he's training." By early summer, the donation jar had overflowed twice. Letters arrived from nearby towns and then from farther places. Veterans who had heard of a man pulled back from winter by 2 abandoned puppies. Mothers who had lost sons to storms and wanted their grief to mean something beyond sorrow. An anonymous check that arrived with only the words, "For the broken who still want to breathe." It was Margaret Hayes who finally looked at the pile of envelopes spread across the folding table in the church basement and said what no one else quite dared to shape aloud. "You don't just build a kennel with this," she said. "You build a place." So they did. The old warehouse on the edge of Pine Hollow had once stored logging equipment back when the forest still fed the town more than tourism did. Its roof sagged in places, and the windows were clouded with years of dust, but the bones of it were strong. Volunteers arrived the week after the decision was made. Retired carpenters, high school students eager to learn something real with their hands. A group of veterans who drove in from 2 counties over. Caleb came when his lungs allowed it, resting often, offering instruction more than labor at first. Emily came every day, mapping the building with careful steps, memorizing distances by echo and texture. Blaze and Snow followed, weaving between legs and tools like living threads binding the work together. The sign went up last. It was carved by an elderly woodworker who had lost the use of 3 fingers in an accident years earlier and insisted on finishing it himself anyway. The letters were uneven but strong. Blaze and Snow, a place for the broken to breathe again. By autumn, the center was alive, not loud, not chaotic. Alive in the way steady things live. The main room held a broad hearth and wide windows. Light poured in during the day, and fire gathered at night. There were quiet corners with soft chairs for people who needed silence before they could speak. There was a long table for shared meals. Behind the building stretched a fenced yard where dogs ran and learned and rested. Training poles rose from the earth like simple monuments. The first formal therapy certification for Blaze and Snow arrived in October, signed by a small non-profit partner hospital 2 towns over. Caleb held the papers in his hands for a long moment before pinning them to the center wall. Emily became, without ever naming it, the heart of the place. She taught the children of trauma how to listen to their own breathing. She taught veterans how to sit in a room without scanning every shadow. She taught both how to place a hand on warm fur and feel something solid return the world to them, one slow heartbeat at a time. "You don't need eyes to learn how you feel," she told them. "You just need permission to feel it." Caleb never returned fully to patrol duty. His lungs would not allow it, and in truth, he no longer wanted to chase winter the way he once had. Instead, he became the quiet backbone of the center, organizing volunteers, structuring training schedules, sitting with men who woke from nightmares shaking as hard as he once had. He did not speak often of the avalanche or the fire, unless asked. When he did, he spoke without drama, as one speaks of storms after learning they no longer own the sky. Time moved the way time always does when healing takes hold, unevenly, quietly, and then suddenly forward. The first anniversary of the fire arrived wrapped once again in snow. Pine Hollow did not announce the gathering, no posters, no speeches ahead of time. Yet by dusk on Christmas Eve, the main hall of the Blaze and Snow Center glowed with quiet life. Veterans sat in chairs drawn near the hearth, their voices low, stories rising and falling like embers. Children scurried between legs, hanging ornaments on a tall pine that reached almost to the rafters. Margaret Hayes stood at a long table, pouring cocoa, with the air of a woman who would accept no argument from cold weather. Harold Benton leaned against the wall with his cap in his hands, his eyes fixed on the center of the room, as if afraid it might vanish if he blinked too long. Emily sat at the old upright piano they had found in storage and restored. Her fingers moved gently across the keys, coaxing out a familiar Christmas hymn the town had sung for generations. Her eyes, still clouded, never found the faces around her, but her smile did. Blaze lay with his head resting on Caleb's boot, his body stretched long and loose in complete trust. Snow curled near Emily's bench, rising occasionally to brush against her leg before settling again, her tail thumping softly against the wooden floor in contentment. These were not guard dogs tonight. They were anchors. Caleb stood near the wall where the photograph hung, the one Linda had taken quietly on the night he woke. It showed him unconscious in the ICU bed, tubes tracing his breath, Blaze's chin resting on his hand. Snow pressed close against his chest, the heart monitor in the background caught in a moment when its rhythm had begun to change. He felt Emily beside him before he heard her. "You always look at that as if it's still happening," she said gently. "Some part of me thinks it is," he replied. "Like if I stop looking, winter might finish what it started." Emily tilted her head. Winter already lost. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with something like wonder in his voice, he said, "If anyone ever asks me what a miracle looks like, I won't talk about fire or medicine. I'll point at two muddy sets of paw prints in the snow and say, 'That.'" Emily smiled, turning her face toward the warmth of the room. "And if someone asks how a heart survives winter," she said softly, "I'll tell them it only needs to learn one thing, that it doesn't have to walk alone." The church bell rang across Pine Hollow, low and steady, its sound flowing over rooftops and frosted trees and the quiet mountain road that had once nearly taken everything from them. Snow fell again outside, clean and soft, no longer a threat, but a benediction. Inside the Blaze and Snow Center, breath moved freely. And in that simple, stubborn motion of living, the broken learned once more how to breathe. In the end, this story reminds us that the miracles of God do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs in the sky. Sometimes they come through small, abandoned lives that refuse to give up. Sometimes they come through a broken man who stands back up when he should have fallen forever. And sometimes they come through kindness that arrives at just the right moment in the coldest season of life. In our daily struggles, when the road feels too heavy and the night feels too long, remember this one truth: God still works through love, through loyalty, and through those who choose to care when it would be easier to walk away. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from, and if you believe in miracles written by God. And if you feel this message is worth spreading, please press subscribe to support this channel so we can continue sharing stories that heal the heart. May God bless you and your family and bring peace to your home. If you believe in this promise, please comment Amen. And once again, thank you for standing with us and supporting this YouTube channel with all your heart.